Of course, heat exchange and amphibians and reptiles, and then the other thing the main thing I was trying to point out last time is that, there's two things to consider. One is the optimal body temperature for organisms, and for ectotherms is important, right? Because in that range of temperatures is where everything works best, most efficiently. But there are other factors that influence what an animal does, and so we're talking about how some of the other outside factors influence what they have to do, even though they can't really obtain optimum body temperatures. And so the last example I gave was the lizard. The males essentially experience temperatures that are not optimal, right? They're too high for most efficient physiological processing. The reason why they do that is what? Mating opportunities, right? So if they don't do that, then they don't get to mate as much, and so they don't leave offspring in the next generation. So other factors are influencing whether these animals can be in their optimal temperature. Another example of that is the Galapagos land iguanas, and so these guys typically inhabit over the season different habitats on the Galapagos Islands. And so generally speaking, during the warm seasons, so you've got warm and cool seasons in the Galapagos Islands. In the warm season, mostly they're spending their time on the plateau. And that is where their food is most abundant, so the resources that they need are more efficiently obtained on the plateau. In the warm season, that's where they spend most of their time. In the cool season, they move from the plateau to the cliff face, so the kind of this perimeter of the islands that they inhabit on the sides of the cliffs. And the important part of that is that the cliff face has a different thermal ecology, thermal distribution. And so this graph kind of shows what's happening on the cliff face. So the reason why they're moving to the cliff face is because they can be active longer, essentially. Even though the temperatures on the plateau get closer to their optimum body temperature. So if we're just thinking about from a thermal standpoint, if they stayed on the plateau, because the temperature on the plateau, even in the cool season, gets actually higher, which is closer to their optimal body temperature, they move from there to the cliff face. The reason why they do that is because even though the temperature is not optimal, it's in their range of activity for a longer period of time during the day, right? So even though they prefer to be in this habitat, they move to a suboptimal habitat because their body temperature allows them to be active longer in that particular habitat during that particular season. So this is just a graph showing the temperature versus time, and this is in the cool season, right? So even though in the cool season the plateau temperature gets higher, which is closer to their optimal body temperature, they don't inhabit those places. They move from those places and go to the cliff face, because here it stays warmer longer. So if they're on the plateau, they essentially have to cease their activity here instead of here, and that is going to allow them to forage longer and do all the things that Galapagos land iguanas do during the day. So essentially they're moving from one place to another, even though that's less optimal in terms of body temperature, because of the ability for them to stay longer or stay active for a longer period of time. Okay, another example of that, another example of how other factors affect the thermoregulation of these animals would be the tropical whiptail lizard. Nematophorus is the genus. That used to be the same genus as our whiptail lizards in North America. Now our whiptail lizards have been placed in a different genus. Spinocelis is the name of our whiptail lizards. But same basic body form of these guys. Really long tails, long hind legs, and they like open habitat. They're high energy animals, really active during the summertime in habitats that have a lot of solar radiation. So, and that's true for this guy as well. So tropical whiptail lizards, of course, have a preferred body temperature range, and so that's generally between 34 and 37 degrees Celsius, which is pretty high, right? So, like I said, they need those high body temperatures because they're really active animals. Whiptail lizard is one name, race runner is another name, because they're high energy animals, and so that's their preferred body temperature. And so in this particular organism, a good portion of their time, about 45% of the time during the day, is spent at body temperatures between 38 and 44 degrees, even though their preferred temperature is 34 to 37. Okay, and so essentially what's happening is these animals are active at body temperatures that are approaching lethal temperature. And we didn't really talk about this too much, but there are lethal temperatures, but then there are critical temperatures, right? I did mention it, I think, but a critical thermal maximum would be a point where they get to a body temperature where they're not operating very efficiently. So their endurance might be less. What else might be less? Their response time is less. Even though it's not going to kill them, it's going to influence their survival or fitness overall. So these guys are operating at body temperatures that are well above their preferred body temperature, and oftentimes it's near lethal temperature for them. So the question is, why are they doing that? And the answer relates to their diet and the distribution of resources in terms of food for these guys. So they're mostly herbivorous, which means what? They eat plants. So they're animals that eat plants, and having a diet that's rich in plants requires a lot more energy to digest. And so that influences what they do, right? So these guys have essentially two choices. Because they eat mostly plant material, their body temperature has to be relatively high for digestion to be efficient, right? So as the body temperature is high, then all the metabolic activities happen faster, digestion is quicker. The problem with that is they don't really have good choices, right? So the distribution of their microhabitats include two things that are opposite each other, like the Nile crocodile, right? So the Nile crocodile is either on the bank where it's really hot, or in the river where it's really cold. Similar to these guys. Because their diet is plant, they have to have relatively high body temperatures. Their choices are either stay on the surface where body temperatures get near lethal, or the other choice is to go into a retreat because there's not a lot of woody shrubs, right? So it's all scrubby kind of habitat. There's no place where they can go that's shaded. And so the only alternative is to go into a hole. At that point, their body temperature drops too low to do what? To digest plant material. So they have to be at the surface a lot just so they can digest their plant material, but that's well outside their optimum body temperature because the choices they have don't match up with that very well. And so ultimately they're going to kind of put themselves at risk, otherwise they're going to essentially starve to death if they can't, because even though they get plenty of food, if they can't digest it, they're starving to death. And so again, that's going to influence the behavior of these organisms. Is a cost associated with thermoregulation. So they can't maintain optimum, so they have to do the next best thing. Okay, so the overall idea I kind of want you to get from that part of it is that these, even though they're ectotherm organisms, they typically maintain body temperatures within a pretty narrow range of temperatures because that's where everything works most efficiently. If no other constraints, that's what they'll do. But because of organisms living in the environment with other things, then sometimes they can't do that. So those are the two main things that I wanted you to get from all that discussion that I just went through. The other part of thermoregulation, of course, is what happens when you can't thermoregulate, right? So thermoregulation is when an organism kind of changes its behavior to make the body temperature fall within that range. If that's not possible, then typically dormancy is what happens, right? And so we're talking about conditions where the environmental influence on temperature is outside of the conditions that can fall within homeostasis. So they can't maintain homeostasis anymore because the conditions don't allow it. Now they have to do something different. And that's generally what we're talking about dormancy. And so amphibians and reptiles become dormant. Other organisms, right, if it gets too cold, if you're an endothermic organism, if it gets too cold where you are, what can you do? Move, go somewhere else. And that's what migration, bird migration is all about, right? So they're too cold, they're moving south, too warm, they're moving north, right? And so, and they're taking advantage of resources and stuff. So if you don't have to rely on the external factors for body temperature, then you can do a lot of different things, or you can eat different things, or you can eat more food. So there's a lot of things you can do as an endothermic organism amphibians and reptiles, generally don't migrate long distances. They're not really capable of doing that. And so the alternative is to become dormant. And so different cues, of course, influence that. Probably what's the main one? What would you think in terms of amphibians and reptiles? What's the main cue that says, okay, it's time to be dormant, I can't thermoregulate anymore?
Frost.
Well, not specifically frost, but cold temperatures, right? So again, it's not freezing necessarily. It's the air temperature is too low, not necessarily freezing, but it's so low, there's nowhere I can be that I can get my body temperature in the range that's gonna be efficient, right? So not necessarily gonna kill me, but if I can't move around very effectively, then I'm not gonna be able to feed, I'm gonna get eaten by predators. So there's the cue. I'm so, okay, now it's time to go somewhere I can be going. So the main one is temperature, especially around here. Also, rainfall is another cue. It's the same concept. The reason why rainfall is important is because that often influences the organism's food. And so if it's so dry, the animals can't find food because all the other organisms are dormant or underground or something, they're gonna not be able to consume enough food, so they become dormant. So even in tropical environments, right, where temperature doesn't change that much, rainfall does. And so you can have dry tropics, wet tropics, and there's a lot of fluctuation in some places, and so those animals become dormant if it's too dry. Food availability is the other thing, but that's typically associated with food also. Not necessarily, but especially for amphibians, if the surface is very dry, then they're going to burrow into the ground and be dormant. There's also some endogenous cues, so that's mostly based on light levels, and so there's a fairly large fluctuation in light levels seasonally if you're in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, so that can signal cues regardless of what the temperature is or how much rainfall. And that's typically because that's most predictable, right? So rainfall and temperature can fluctuate pretty wildly and not necessarily be corresponding with the season, but the amount of light doesn't, right? So that's typically a more predictable cue that these animals use to stimulate dormancy. So dormancy in amphibians and reptiles generally broken up into two different categories. One is brumation, which is similar to hibernation. Brumation is more appropriate for ectothermic organisms, and it's a physiological difference. And so mostly brumation involves the use of glycogen as an energy store as they're experiencing these periods of dormancy. So they're not actively feeding for the most part. And so that's the molecule that they use primarily during those periods of dormancy. Hibernation using other forms of energy, and so that's typically things like mammals and other organisms that are endothermic typically are hibernating. So brumation is similar, it's a response to cold temperatures, but the physiological mechanisms that allow them to get through that period are different for ectotherms. Then the other category is estivation, and that's essentially dormancy as the environment becomes dry. And so, of course, many times these two things happen together, and so they're not necessarily one or the other. Sometimes they're both, but typically estivation includes what happens when conditions become too dry. There are some fish species that do that as well when their habitat dries up and they have to experience times of dormancy. Okay, so essentially we're talking about behavioral responses to changing seasons. Typically we're talking about when things get cold. And so the main outcome when amphibians and reptiles become dormant is the behavioral process of searching for a location that will not reach sub-zero temperatures, 0 degrees Celsius. And the reason why that's significant is what? Why is that important?
Freezing.
What's that?
Freezing.
It's freezing, which would mean what happens?
They would die.
Well, they do die, but why are they dying?
Their body shifts.
Huh?
Their body shifts.
Well, why is freezing such a good, why is that so important?
If your blood freezes, it must.
Yeah, because the fluid, right, living organisms are mostly fluid, which is mostly water, and if water freezes, then that's gonna form ice in the bloodstream, and so physiologically, we can't tolerate that. And so, you know, we can't either, of course, but, you know, we're gonna experience lethal conditions well below freezing if we have hypothermia, basically. We'll have other mechanisms that are gonna be lethal to us. But amphibians and reptiles, their body temperatures can get really low. As long as you don't actually have ice forming in the blood, the plasma, then they typically are gonna be able to survive that for a period of time. So for most, you know, the temperature at which they're seeking refuge in places that don't get below 0 degrees Celsius. That's not always the case. Some of them can tolerate sub-zero temperatures for a short period of time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The sites, even though, you know, physiologically what they're doing is brumation, the sites where these animals are seeking are referred to as hibernacula, which is plural. A single location would be a hibernaculum. And that, so typically that, when you hear the word, you know, snake den, a den of snakes, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a place where these animals are going so that they don't freeze to death during the wintertime. And in the spring, they'll emerge, and if they're hibernating or brumating communally, they all come out from that spot. They're not necessarily there because each other's there. They're there because that's a good spot to be that doesn't get below 0, and they come out and they emerge from these places. And so we visited some hibernacula in this class, and essentially they're just looking for a space underground that doesn't freeze or is not flooded. And so the places where that can be is variable, and it really depends on how cold it gets, how long it stays cold, all those things, right? And that varies depending on where you are on the globe. So in Tennessee, where we are, we have some cold winters, but our winters don't last that long, right? And so sometimes the air temperatures is kind of close to 0 degrees Celsius, sometimes it's well below that. So we're in a region that's pretty variable. If you go a little bit, you know, if you go into Florida, they'll have days that are below 0, but a lot of the days are above 0 in the wintertime. And so the places where these animals seek refuge is highly variable depending on the condition. So it might be, well, it's always under something, right, underground. It could be underwater, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It might be in, you know, crevices and spaces created from rock kind of habitat, you know. So if you go towards Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee, there's more rock outcroppings. Southern Illinois, there's places and there's spaces behind the rock that are they're going to be protected from freezing, and that's where these animals are congregating or looking for a place to spend the winter. And so that's going to allow them to kind of be protected during the winter months. It could be closer to the surface, right? If it's not really cold, if it doesn't get cold in that place, it could be just in a hollowed out rock log or stump or something like that. They're just sitting there. Even though it's close to the surface, it's not going to freeze. Habitat or structures that are kind of decomposing are going to produce some heat by themselves. And so, you know, even if you have a compost pile at home, it's not going to freeze in the middle because there's decomposition that's creating energy and that's creating some heat. And so it doesn't have to be deep underground. It just has to be far enough underground so that the animal doesn't experience freezing conditions. It could be just under the leaves. And again, that's as you move more south, temperatures aren't as cold. It could be just under, you know, 6 inches of leaves, again, decomposing, creating a little bit of heat, so it's not going to freeze solid, and the animal's going to be protected from that. Of course, the advantage of that, what's the advantage of just being under the leaves if that's where you can be?
You can probably still catch stuff, still feed.
Yeah, you're still close enough to the surface to be active if it becomes warm. If you're way down in a hole and it gets warm one day, then by the time you get up to the surface, then it's going to be cold again. So there's some advantages to staying close to the surface if you can, if the temperature is warm, warm enough or not really cold for extended periods of time. Okay, so generally speaking, when these animals are dormant, most of their activity stops. So, which is kind of cool, right? Because we're talking about animals that are ectothermic, which means their body temperature is highly influenced by the temperature of the surrounding air or fluid or whatever they're in. And that directly affects our metabolism. And so if the body temperature is low, what else is low? Metabolism is low, which means you're not using as much ATP, which means you don't need as much oxygen, you're not producing as much carbon dioxide, you're not producing nitrogenous waste, all the things that are associated with metabolism are really, really slow. And so that can allow you to be inactive, you just sit there and wait till it warms up. If you're an endothermic organism, the problem with that during the winter is what? Why is it so hard for an endothermic organism during the winter? What's the main stress?
Food.
Finding food, because you have to find it all the time. Because you've got high body temperature, high metabolism, all the stuff that you need is happening fast, and you're using it up very quickly. If you don't eat for a couple of days, that's it. These guys can go for 4 months without eating anything because their metabolism is so low. And we'll see some more example of that. So during that time period, typically the body temperature matches the environmental temperature, which would be, could be measured right next to the organism. And that is called thermoconforming, right? So now they are not doing what? They're not thermoregulating. They're just sitting there and letting their body temperature go up and down depending on whatever the temperature is in the hibernaculum. If it gets warm enough, sometimes they can stop their dormancy and come to the surface and do stuff. But typically they're just letting their body temperature fluctuate. And it might fluctuate a lot or very little depending on where they are over the winter period. So as I was saying, the physiological processes are reduced, really low metabolic rate, don't have to, it's kind of hard to imagine, right? But your oxygen need is low, which means you don't have to do what? You don't have to breathe. The only reason why we're breathing is to get rid of CO2 and get in oxygen so we can synthesize ATP. If you're using so little of it, you don't even have to breathe, because your metabolism is so low. Again, they're using up little resources, and so most of these animals are going to have some, like I said, glycogen that they're using to maintain just basic metabolic needs, but that's always going to be really low during the winter because metabolism is so low. Sometimes there's some activity in these organisms during their dormancy. They might move. Typically, movement is going to be to find a different spot within the hibernaculum. It might be a little bit warmer, so if they experience places in the hibernaculum that are getting closer to 0 degrees Celsius, then they might move to a different spot. It might be moving to a different spot to take advantage of more oxygen-rich environments if we're talking about aquatic organisms. And so that's typical of dormancy. They don't typically feed unless dormancy is broken, right? And so again, we're in a region of the world where our wintertime temperatures can fluctuate quite a bit. We can have sub-zero temperatures one day, and then it could be in 15, 16 degrees Celsius the next day. And if that happens for a few days, some of these animals that are close enough to the surface can come to the surface and they might actually feed. It's pretty rare for that to happen, but it can happen if temperatures are warm enough. They don't typically mate. There are some animals that will mate prior to brumation, prior to going into the hibernaculum, and store sperm, and then in the spring, eggs will be fertilized, and then the females will give birth after that. So they don't mate during brumation, but they might store sperm if they're of certain species that are capable of doing that. Like I said, because they don't store sperm, because they don't mate, there's no gestation. So females that are gravid or have eggs are not brumate. They're going to lay the eggs or give birth to the offspring first, and then they're going to go into brumation. Okay. There are some animals that yes.
What does their brain function look like while they're brumation?
Brain function? I don't know specifically. It's probably, their responses, I don't know if, I don't really know if there's any physiological measurement of like neurological activity, but they will respond. For ectothermic organisms, it's kind of hard to tell, because if their body temperature is real low, they might be responding. They know you're there,
yeah,
and they might flick their tongue out, but it's going to be because they can't generate enough muscle activity
yeah,
at low temperatures. So I don't know if anybody's really ever studied that, so that's a good question. But they do, they respond to signals.
It's not
They
completely
might-
shut down.
No, they're not completely shut down, right? Yeah, they're not shut down. And so, you know, they will respond if their body temperature is high enough to allow like a visible response. So the brain activity is still there. Okay, so some of these animals are spending their time underwater, right? And mostly we're talking about, well, aquatic organisms, of course. So if you think about an amphiuma. The amphiuma is not gonna come out of the swamp and find a hole in the bank because they're aquatic organisms. So they're gonna spend their time at the bottom of the aquatic environment, could be buried in the sediment of an aquatic environment. So that's pretty typical for aquatic organisms, even aquatic reptiles like turtles especially. They're gonna spend time at the bottom. And the reason why that's a good spot is because the maximum density of water is about 4 degrees Celsius. So when the air temperature reaches 4 degrees Celsius and the water reaches 4 degrees Celsius, then it kind of sinks to the bottom, right? So that 4 degrees Celsius water just kind of sinks to the bottom, and then, because that's the maximum density. If the air temperature gets colder than 4 degrees Celsius, like it gets, you know, -2 or -3, then the liquid water on the surface is gonna do what? It freezes, and since ice is less dense than water, it floats on the top. So you've got this really cold water or ice floating on the surface. Below it is always gonna be above zero, and it's gonna be about 4 degrees Celsius. So if you go up, it's gonna get a little colder, and then it's gonna get to zero, and it's gonna be solid ice. And so, and of course, you know, there's mixing and things like that happen in the spring and fall, and that's because of that, right? If it's deep enough, then there's always gonna be a layer underneath that's liquid. If it's not deep enough, if we're talking about, you know, vernal pool, if it gets super cold, what happens?
Holding.
It just freezes solid all the way to the bottom. What happens to the organisms that are in it?
Gonna die.
They're gone, right? So these animals, I'm not talking about shallow pools, we're talking about ponds and swamps that aren't gonna dry up. And so that's gonna be typically the case. And that's a great place to be, right? Because it's above zero, and because they're ectothermic organisms, they don't have to come to the surface because they don't need oxygen, they're not getting rid of CO2, they're not using up any of their energy stores. And so aquatic turtles especially are notorious, and that's one of the reasons why they're the first you see on the logs in the springtime, because they've been under the pond for 4 or 5 months, and now they're coming to the surface to, you know, to get their metabolism going again. Okay, so essentially what's happening when we're talking about these animals that are aquatic hibernators is that most of them have some type of cutaneous respiration. We talked about some that respire through their anal openings, and so essentially any place where there's thin skin and there's vascularization, then you can get some oxygen from the water into the bloodstream, and that can supply the cells with their metabolic demands. There are lots of amphibians that do this. There are some reptiles, Crocinies, which is the painted turtle, Sternophorus, which is, anybody know Sternophorus? That's the musk turtle, Damnophis, so the ribbon snakes and garter snakes. So these animals are typically gonna be aquatic or semi-aquatic, and that's a perfect place for them to hibernate because it's above 4, their metabolism is low. What else is a great place, or what other reasons it makes under the pond a good place to hibernate?
You said constant temperature.
Constant temperature, that's one
Can they
thing.
find prey there?
What's that?
Can they find prey there?
Well, they don't normally eat when they're inactive.
Predation.
Yeah, they're protected, right? Unless you specifically go down to the bottom of the pond and start looking around for prey items in the wintertime, which you'd be dumb to do, you're not gonna find them, right? So, you know, of course, there's aquatic predators too, but, you know, most fishes even in the ponds are gonna be relatively inactive during the wintertime. So you don't go fishing so much in the winter because they're not active. Some of these animals will burrow in the substrate, so they just go to the bottom and then they just burrow into the substrate of the pond or the stream, which is even better protected, still above 0 degrees Celsius, and also even more protected from the aquatic predators that might be lurking around. Sometimes in that type of environment, the immediate area around them becomes anoxic, so no oxygen. Their metabolism is low, but it's not 0, right? So they still have to have some oxygen. If the environment is around them is without oxygen, then that's gonna be a problem for them, because they can't get oxygen any other way than through the skin if you're underwater. And so, for the animals that do that, some of them can tolerate that for a short period of time, and that's called anaerobisis. And so what they're doing essentially is using glucose, getting ATP from that initial breakdown of glucose, and as it turns into pyruvate, that's basically glycolysis. So they're getting some ATP from that, and so that doesn't need oxygen. So they're tolerant of that for a short period of time. They're also tolerant of the byproducts of that, which is lactic acid. So that's, of course, one of the reasons, you know, we can't go that long without oxygen. We get buildup of lactic acid in our cells, and that kind of shuts down the ATP production mechanism, and then you just have to stop. And then, of course, there's some lingering consequences of that in our muscle cells. If you've ever been sore, you've experienced that. So most animals can tolerate a little bit. Some of these animals that hibernate under the pond can tolerate more of it, so they can get high levels of lactic acid in the bloodstream and not show the consequences of it. But then the other thing that they typically do is move around, and so that's one of the things that happens when they're hibernating underwater, especially if they're in the sediment, right? If you're in the sediment, then the water's not moving around, and once you've used up all the oxygen from the sediment, then you have to move around some. So they'll move from one place to another, and then burrow down again and start the process all over again without coming to the surface to get oxygen. Okay, so for the aquatic organisms, because they're protected, right? Because the temperature is going to get to 0 or 4 degrees Celsius, and that's pretty much it, pretty stable. And if they can tolerate low oxygen, that's a good place to hibernate. If you're a terrestrial organism, then the temperature can fluctuate quite a bit, and you can get well below 0 degrees, Celsius at the surface. And so they're trying to find places that are going to be well below that. Some examples include this guy, Terrapin carolina. Anybody know that one? That's the eastern box turtle. So what they do is they just essentially dig down into the soil, and they'll do that kind of incrementally. So as the fall turns into late fall, air temperatures start getting lower, they'll dig down into the sediment, and then they'll just keep going deeper as the temperatures get cooler, and that's in the fall and the winter. And then as the surface temperature increases in the spring, they just start coming closer and closer and closer. So they're still protected, but they're getting closer, so that when temperature appropriate, then they're already close to the surface. And then I think we saw a box turtle, was it with you guys? It was all dirty, right? Because they just bury into the dirt instead of looking for a place. Because you imagine a turtle, it's going to be pretty hard for a terrestrial turtle to find a spot to hibernate, right? Because if you think about all these other organisms, if you're on a cliff face, climbing around on rocks, turtles aren't very good at that. Or little holes in the ground where the roots used to be, and a snake is going to slither right in there. A turtle can't do that because of the shell. So they're just going to dig down into the sediment, and then in the springtime they'll come back out. But the idea is the same. They are looking for places that are always going to be above 0 degrees Celsius, but also, depending on, in West Tennessee, there's another concern for certain animals, and that's because we're so low, you got to also be not underwater if you're a snake or something like a lizard or painted turtle or slider. So some other examples, just Pantherophis, which is rat snakes and relatives, Gritalis, which are rattlesnakes. They're essentially looking for spaces, and this is true for typically all snakes, unless they're real small. You don't have to go real deep, but these guys are looking for places. Around here, mostly what happens is as the trees on the hill die, their roots rot, which leaves space. And then if there's an opening on the surface, they'll just find that opening and climb down into that space and spend the winter there. Again, good place because you get decomposition. And around here, the surface doesn't freeze very deep because once you get below the frost line, it's going to be pretty safe from freezing. Okay, some of these animals can tolerate sub-zero temperatures for brief periods, right? So when the air temperature is -1 or -2, they're not going to die immediately. They can tolerate that for short periods of time. But typically, if it stays like that for much longer, if they're not in a place that's above that, then they're not gonna be able to survive that. The problem associated with it is what we talked about before. You've got intracellular ice crystal formation. So the water inside the cell freezes and makes ice crystals. And that ultimately is gonna cause damage to cellular structures. What are some examples of cellular structures?
The nucleus.
There you go,
mitochondria.
the organelles, right? So nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi, all those things that make the cell work, they're made up of lipid bilayers, and if you've got these ice crystals floating around in there, that's gonna damage them, and they're not gonna be able to carry out their function. So the function of a living organism is basically the function of the cell. If the cell's not working, then the living organism can't survive that. So you've got intracellular ice crystal formation that causes damage. The other problem is extracellular ice formation, which is a little bit easier for them to tolerate, but extracellular is what?
What? Outside.
Outside of the cell, so mostly the blood, the plasma, the liquid that's not inside the cell. And so that can also be a problem, because it changes the osmolarity of the environment, right? So if you've got 90% water in the plasma and 90% water in the cell, then you're at equilibrium, which is fine. But if you take some of that liquid water in the plasma and freeze it, then it's not liquid water anymore, and so what has happened to the other stuff that's dissolved in the plasma? It increases in concentration, so the concentration of that stuff goes up, and relative to the cell, now water's rushing out of the cell, and the cell's gonna be dehydrated. So that can also cause a problem. This one is more easily tolerated by most organisms, because you can do some cellular mechanisms to kind of overcome that. And so ultimately it's causing drying out of the cell. So intracellular, if ice crystals form in the cell and damage organelles, that's it for the organism. They can't tolerate that. Some can tolerate extracellular, so these guys, Terrapene carolina, chrysomeres, hatchlings, that's a painted turtle, Pseudacris triceriata, which is what? It's Ferriarum now, Pseudacris ferriarum. Upland chorus frog. What about Pseudacris or Dryophytes crucifer? Peeper, Lithobates, those are the leopard frogs. So these animals could tolerate extracellular freezing, and which makes sense. Terrapene carolina, why might you expect that guy to be able to tolerate that? Something I just told you.
What is the Terrapene carolina?
Eastern box turtle. They're burrowing, but they're doing it how? Incrementally, right? So they're going down, they're not going down into a deep hole right away. They're near the surface, and they could be exposed to sub-zero temperatures if the weather changes and they're coming back out. Oh, it's a warm day, and then the next day it's really cold. Then they're gonna be exposed to that. So those guys can tolerate some extracellular freezing, and I'll talk about it in a minute why they can do that. Chrysomeres hatchlings, these guys that's the painted turtle. And one of the things that's true of this group is that sometimes the hatchlings will overwinter in the nest. So the turtle egg hatches late in the fall. Instead of emerging from the nest late in the fall, right before winter, where there's no food available and they're gonna die, they just stay in the nest. And then in the spring, early in the spring, they come up. Of course, they have to survive the winter, right? So because they're in the nest, they can't move around, they can't go to the bottom of the pool, so the nest is vulnerable to freezing. And so these guys are more tolerant of that, because they've adapted to that. So they've got some cellular mechanisms that will help them with extracellular freezing. These guys, why would you expect them to be tolerant of it? Especially these ones, this one and this one. Why would you expect that of these particular frogs?
The first one's.
The first one's out, right? So in January, you hear Chorus frogs, because they're tolerant, they can be on the surface and experience low temperatures, experience a little bit of extracellular freezing, and that helps them in their ecology of being the first ones, right, which is helpful, because now we're the first ones out calling, everybody hears each other, and we're being successful in that way. So here's a little hatchling coming out, I don't know what time of year, but that's what they're doing, here's a frog calling, etc. Here's a frozen wood frog. So the reason why they can do that is because they're producing what are called cryoprotectants. Basically, cryo is freezing, protectants is protecting from freezing. And so it's mostly glycerol or glucose, and they're producing these solutes, basically, that either lower the temperature, freezing temperature, and also at the same time moderate what happens with the flow of water into and out of the cell. So they're changing the concentration of the cell so that the cells aren't losing water when this particular event happens. And it also, lowers the freezing point. So ice is not forming if the freezing point is really depressed because of the production of these cryoprotectants. Okay, that's it. I'll stop here because that's the end of the